thank you very much. First of all, I have to say, besides the wine glasses, this is just like teaching a class. All my students are sitting in the back. And I know that's because you want to do email and Facebook. So come on. Now, I hope you can see everything. I do have some a lot of material in here that might be small print, but I do want to say that I will share the information I'm going to talk about today with Peter, and you can email it to the group that is here today, so you'll have some material to kind of look at. So it's very much an honor to be here to talk to you. I've been looking at trying to understand and better communicate the issues behind climate and viticulture worldwide for quite a long time, and it's definitely a passion, something I really enjoy doing. Today we're going to walk through some material that I've been working on. Not quite finished yet, but some good information I think that will help define some characteristics of Lake County and really just the broader region as well. So what I'm going to try to do is give you a little bit of a background talk on some work I've been doing in the western United States, carry that down to the North Coast, and then carry it down to giving you some information about Lake County's climate structure. We'll also talk a little bit about climate variability issues. We know that living in the western United States, that we have these, they're very prominent in terms of how they influence vintage variations. So we'll talk a little bit about what that's all about. And then we'll try to tie that into our current situation and what the 2013 forecast looks like. So far it's held out pretty much to the way it looked in January, and I think we still have some pretty good information for the rest of the year right now. So anyway, I always kind of like to start this out by talking about the way I view issues, and I'm sure the way most growers view it as well, is that climate presents some very distinct kind of temporal and spatial issues or risks in terms of allowing us to ripen a given crop and produce a good product. And these risks are typically tied back to individual weather events that typically are very short-term and localized. They can be things like hail or frost or freezes or heavy rain events. So knowing something about that is very important in terms of our climate variability issues that can be seasonal to decadal in length, and knowing something about that is important because we could be producing in a period of time which is more of a challenge than it might have been otherwise. These typically are associated with either dry periods, wet periods, warm periods, cool periods, so we have to understand what those patterns look like. And then, of course, the last one here is this climate structure and potential change issues that are out there, trying to tie back to kind of what types of climates in a given region allow us to produce what types of wine styles from what types of varieties. And so for me, these all come back to crop risk, production and quality variability, and suitability issues. And we're going to talk about a little bit of each one of these. We'll look at a little bit of frost-freeze kind of timing for the region, talk a little bit about climate variability, and then also look at general structure in the North Coast, well, western U.S. to North Coast to Lake County. So in doing so, I'm going to go back to a piece of research that I published not too long ago in the American Journal of Enology and Viticulture, and the citation for it's here, and I can even forward that to you as well. But this was one of the first real comprehensive looks at climates in the western United States, doing something arguably that was done years ago by Winkler and Amarine and his group, their groups at UC Davis, but I was trying to update it to the technology that we have today in terms of spatial climate and the information that we can work with. And so in doing this, what I set out to do was something that was not very easy. First of all, capturing all the American viticulture areas in the western United States. At the time when I was doing this, as most of you know, if you've been involved in the process, when you submit to the TTB for one of these, you submit a hand-drawn map and meets and bounds definitions. It's the most archaic thing I've ever seen. And going back in to try to capture these boundaries is not always easy, but working with some students, we digitized 131 AVAs back in 2008. There's probably about another 15 that have been added to it since then, and we're in the middle of trying to update that. We crafted complete what's called spatial assessments of different characteristics of these AVAs, looking at how much area is involved, what the elevation structure is, topographical structure, looking at different kind of climate indices, and we did it at scales that is fairly useful
from 10 to about 400 meters. So trying to get the best spatial data we could to assess the individual areas. We examined also the usefulness of different types of climate indices that people use in viticulture. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with these. We're mostly going to look at one thing. But we did this across a whole array of different indices. The other thing about this is that this work that was published in 2010, I'm basically doing this for every grape growing region in the world. Right now we're working on Greece and South Africa and China. But I have Europe done, Australia done, New Zealand done, parts of Chile and South America done as well. And so what you're going to be seeing, there's similar work being done elsewhere. So anyway, this is just looking at growing degree days over the western United States. This is a very standard formulation for it, and the standard kind of structural kind of identities behind the regions that Winkler developed years ago, with some minor adjustments to it that I'll talk about here in just a minute. But let me give you a sense of what doing spatial climate studies kind of tells you. First of all, we were using the 71 to 2000 data, which is a climate normal. The 81 to 2010 climate normals are out now, but they're not fully processed. I'm in probably within the next year, I'll have them all done and updated. And so we'll have some new data because that 10-year difference is important to understand kind of what the climates are like. But what we did is we looked at all of the AVAs across the western United States, and what we found is kind of some interesting things. First of all, the growing degree days, the average growing degree days over all AVAs is right around 3,000 units. We have the lowest median degree days is about 1530 in viable grape growing regions up in the Puget Sound area and parts of northern Oregon. And the highest being 4520, of course, down in the South Central Valley in Madera in that location. If you look at the class structure across what we know these Winkler regions to be, you guys all operate to some degree or another in this. The Western US is mostly a region 3, about 33% of our AVAs, and then a little bit, about a quarter of region 2, and then about 20% region 4, and then a little smattering between the cooler areas. I've kind of since done some more work with this. One of the things, and I don't know how many of you paid attention to this, but when Winkler and Amarine first did this work, they never specified a lower end to region 1 or an upper end to region 5. And we've since defined that pretty well, looking at grape growing regions all over the world. So I have some new information with that here in just a little bit. And you'll see it in the coming maps that I'll show. If you look at spatial distribution within AVAs, they really depend upon elevation differences, of course. We know that some AVAs encompass higher elevation areas that typically would not be suitable for viticulture. So there are some fairly strong differences because of that. And there's also differences between the proximity and orientation to the coast of a given growing region. We also know from looking at temporal data that the variation is plus or minus 325 to 500 degree days, roughly 75% of the time. Or saying that another way, is that 75% of the vintages can vary as much as 325 to 500 degree days year to year. So it's a big variation. And that's what we experience across our climate normals. So what this also allows us to do is to not only say that the median AVA values are X, Y, and Z, but it also allows us to say something about how much of a given area makes up a given climate type. And I just have thrown in 8 different locations here, from Eola, Amity Hills in Oregon, to Madera in California. And you can see that the Eola, Amity Hills is 100% a region 1. If you go to another place like Napa, it's mostly a region 3 and a region 4. You go to another place like Anderson Valley, mostly a region 2 and 3, and then Madera, 100% a region 5. So it allows us to look at spatially what's happening within these growing regions in terms of the overall structure of climate in that area. So here's just a snapshot, getting a little closer, looking at the North Coast AVAs. Again, this was as of 2008, so if there are new ones there, I don't have them on this map right now. I know you probably can't read that, right? Okay. So I'll try to help you out. That's why you had to sit closer, I told you. I'll do the best I can to kind of put this in perspective. But this is all in that published paper that I mentioned earlier. And so you can go back and take a look at it. But the idea is that with this kind of information, we can say something about the characteristic areas and elevations of these regions. We can look at their median structure, going from the Benmore Valley at about 2,600 feet in elevation, down to the Susan Valley at about 80 feet in elevation. We can also see very small places like Cole Ranch, which is, I think, still the smallest AVA in the United States at 80 hectares. Having a very small variation in terms of its overall elevation limits. And then you get to a place like the North Coast, which is an uber AVA covering a large area, having a wide range of elevational characteristics overall. We can take this kind of information and also go into the Lake County area. The outer boundary here is Lake County, and then the inner boundaries are the AVAs of that area, the Clear Lake area, Red Hills, High Valley, Benmore, and Gwinnett Valley. These are the basic areas for each one of those, going from 580 hectares, not planted area, but just area of ground, to almost 90,000 hectares in Clear Lake. And the elevations range from, a low of about 1,000 feet in the Gwinnett Valley to median elevations of almost 2,600 feet in the Benmore Valley. Now, I don't have all the exact statistics on this, and Peter may be able to help me out with this, but there's roughly about 200 growers or so growing about 8,500 acres within Lake County, within these, not necessarily within all of the AVAs, but largely in the Upper Lake, down in Big Valley, Kelseyville Bench, and the other AVAs here. The majority of vineyards are planted at 1,500 feet or higher in elevation, and a large number of varieties, as you know, but Cabernet Sauvignon and Sauvignon Blanc are probably the two most. So we can go and look at now some climate information for these areas, and again, this is the North Coast, and this is degree days. You can look at the spatial pattern of it there. And again, you can read this, of course, and so you can see all these numbers. But the idea is that we can divide out a given AVA. It doesn't matter where it is. And I've even included a couple, Dunnigan Hills and Capay Valley over here, and Covello up to the north. But we can estimate by taking any one of these boundaries and estimate what the climate structure is in that given area. And so, for example, we could look at any one of these, and I think I've got the medians all highlighted, going from 2,600 median degree days in the Sonoma Coast to 4,217 in the Dunnigan Hills. So that's a pretty wide range, going from a coastal zone environment to an inland environment. You can also look at a place like Anderson Valley. Anderson Valley, because of orientation to the coast, has a very cool end to a very warm end with a fairly wide range. Or you can go to a place like Calistoga, which is much more kind of an inland valley area, a little bit more of a rain shadow effect, and a little bit narrower range of overall growing degree days. If we take that same information, and I'm sorry, I forgot, I put cities in here, because sometimes when you look at this, you get lost. It looks like a spaghetti diagram almost, and so I put the cities in here so you can kind of see where some of the locations are. If we take this information and we go down into the Lake County area, this is what we see for the locations there. The range from a median standpoint is roughly about 3,250 to 3,600 degree days. But it does range from a fairly cool upper elevation areas, about 2,800, to just over 3,800 in some of the warmest areas within the regions. If we take a look at this a little closer, and I was talking with somebody last night about this, and I think this is very important. We're just looking at these numbers for these degree days over this area. We also need to look at a couple of characteristics of it. This is just simply taking from January through December the curve or the accumulation of degree days for a given location. And so this is a location that arguably all of you know, and so is this one. And they do some similar things, but they get there differently. And this is an important piece of the puzzle. So for example, one region here has early accumulation, which drives earlier growth. We can go back over here and we could say they have similar peak accumulation, meaning that they're right in the middle of the summer, they're doing kind of similar things. But one achieves it from having high daytime temperatures and low nighttime temperatures, and the other one achieves it from having the opposite, having lower daytime temperatures and higher nighttime temperatures. So you get kind of that opposite effect. The other piece that comes into play here is that they have similar harvest dates, but they have very, very different ripening conditions in terms of cool nights. So they get a truncation of the season, which means something a little different for ripening perspectives. Anybody have any idea where these two locations might be? Of course you don't. You would just be guessing, because it's kind of hard just to be able to look at any two curves like this, but these happen to be Bordeaux and Oakville. So again, similar places growing similar varieties to similar maybe style or quality issues, and yet very differently in terms of how they get there climatically, okay? So I thought I'd throw this in because this is a true spaghetti diagram. And I know you can't necessarily see all these names, but these are all of the stations that I could get the most recent data for the North Coast and surrounding area. So you can pick out which one you are. The red, I'll just give you the perspective on this. The red one here is winters over in the valley. And then we can go down here to the blue one. The lightest blue color is Fort Bragg. So very different types of structures there. You can also look at where heat accumulation really kind of starts. Anytime you get over about 100 is really initiating a growing season type of characteristics. But you can see the range across here, even across the base areas there. There's quite a large range. You can also see that the truncation of the seasons are different depending on kind of where you are overall. And you can also see that the general structure is about the same. However, proximity to the coast will determine a little bit about how that curve looks. But anyway, I just wanted to highlight the point that they're quite different overall. So if we look at a couple of other things, I have some pretty good data for last frost. This is spatial data that has been mapped out by the USDA. It's the standard for frost data for the United States, and this is just for the North Coast as well. The median last spring frost date is March 15th. But it can range up to 75 days across this region. And you can look at some of the, if you can see the numbers there. I tried to include everybody, and of course in doing that I made the fonts pretty small. But if you look at it, the median dates go from May 2nd up in the Covella area down to February 16th for Donegan Hills. We can look at individual places like Potter Valley has a fairly narrow range of about 20 days. Where a place like Napa Valley, a fairly large area, again has a much wider, almost 90-degree range in last spring frost date. If you go up to Lake County, this is the structure that maps out there, and you can see the numbers. Basically, the median last spring frost date ranges from middle of October to the 1st of April. Of course, the smaller areas like Benmore Valley doesn't have a very wide range in frost dates. But a place like Clear Lake that's a little bit larger has a much wider timing for last spring frosts. You can do the same kind of thing looking at the first fall frost, which doesn't tend to be quite as big of a variation in an area like this. But similar kinds of information, though, here we can see that the median across the entire region is November 29th. And that's pretty sufficient for the vines going into a kind of a slow dormancy in most areas. But there's a range from as low as early as October 22nd to as late as December 13th. And again, you know, Covello up in the north and this area up in here tends to have the earliest median dates, while some of the higher elevation areas and even into the Central Valley has a little bit of the later occurrences. Russian River Valley ranges about 40 days from early November to mid-December, and a place like northern Sonoma, mid-October to mid-December, depending on location. So if you go up again, looking at the Lake County area, focusing on it a little bit, you can see that the range goes from November 3rd through December 8th. And again, some places like Benmore Valley, fairly small area, not much difference from place to place within that region. We can look at the frost-free period, and again, this is less of an issue in a place like in Oregon. This becomes really important because we're often limited by that growth period that we can potentially have here. Much less of an issue with a median over 250 days from a minimum of 173 to 293. The 173 is occurring again up in this area where it's definitely cooler. and then going down into parts of down in here and into the valley up into nearly 300 frost-free days. Redwood Valley, a fairly wide range of almost 50 days across the region. And then, Knights Valley has a much broader range, typically because there's a little bit more elevational differences. Going into Lake County averages about 200 to 250 days or so in terms of its length of period between frosts. But again, some of the higher elevation areas like Clear Lake that has some upper landscapes typically has a little bit shorter growing season, but not dramatic overall. Precipitation, of course, less of an issue, but we need to consider it just because of overall amounts and availability. This is just annual. We have some pretty good data. We can break it out into seasons, and I've been doing that, but I thought I'd just show you the annual numbers here. If we look at it, the average rainfall, of course, over in the valley, as we move off into the Central Valley there, 22 inches, while we get up to nearly 60 inches in some of the Mendocino Ridge and Rockpile areas in terms of growing regions. Napa Valley has a fairly wide range because of some upper elevation areas there, almost a 40-inch range in annual precipitation. So it's a strong rain shadow effect versus a mountain effect in a given area. And Alexander Valley has a little smaller range, mostly because of the way it's open to the coastline, of about 12 inches from 40 to about 52. If you look at Lake County does have some mountainous areas that do produce a little higher rainfall, but also some rain shadow effects that are fairly prominent. Values range from about 34 inches to about 45 inches overall. Wettest areas get up into 60, 65 inches in terms of some of the higher elevation zones. So that's kind of some spatial structure stuff. So let's talk a little bit about climate variability. You guys have mostly lived this, seeing how vintages go back and forth between years. When you talk a little bit about it, I've been doing some work looking at this globally, trying to understand what are the climate variability mechanisms that are out there and how do they influence our vintages, both from a climatic standpoint and then from a production standpoint or quality standpoint. Most of the mechanisms that we typically hear about in the news or you are familiar with are ones that are winter dominant, things like El Nino or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation are really much more winter dominant mechanisms, but they tend to have a strong lag time that leads into the spring and can lead into the summer. And so our vintages in 2010 and 11 were tied to a very strong lag of what was happening in the Pacific Ocean. We need to talk about that a little bit. A lot of times there's very strong interaction between regional and distant mechanisms. The idea behind that is that, and I like to put it this way, not all El Niños are created equal. And the reason is that they have to be either in unison or out of phase with things going on in the North Pacific. So when we talk about El Nino Southern Oscillation, it's a very strong tropical mechanism here. And the specific decadal mechanism that's up here, if these two things are in unison, then the impacts on our regional variability is much stronger. If they're out of sequence, then the impacts are much less. And so knowing what those are, we can use that to be doing some pretty strong seasonal forecasting. It's a fairly easy tool within climate studies. However, one of the things I do want to point out is that there's not a lot been done with this. We're publishing some stuff right now about the Indian Ocean dipole and El Nino Southern Oscillation effects in Australia, and very, very strong interaction there, and seasonal to even biannual kind of predictability is pretty strong within the Australia-New Zealand sector. So let's look at some situations here. This is just some diagrams looking at ocean temperatures, and in reality, there are more than just these 4 different types of situations. There's 9 possible combinations that the North Pacific and the South and the tropical Pacific can be in. We typically can either be El Nino, La Nina, or neutral, and some people in the media like to call that La Nada. You guys have heard that, right? I mean, it clearly happens. The media's got to have a good word for something like that. And so La Nada's been out there. It just means we're in normal conditions in terms of the ocean temperatures in the tropics. In the northern Pacific, we also have this situation in which we can be either in a cold or warm phase of the ocean in the North Pacific. And how that plays out with the tropical Pacific is very important for us, very important. If we look at situations like this, if we're in an El Nino where the tropical waters are really warm and a positive phase of what's called the PDO, where there's warm water along the western United States and cold water further out, these are the conditions that happen. We typically get a situation where a strong trough develops out over here and a strong ridge develops over the western United States. And it becomes kind of a quasi-stuck pattern in the atmosphere. And in the late winter, early spring, if we're in those kind of conditions, this is what we typically get. The Pacific Northwest, Oregon and northward, is typically warmer and drier, and California is wetter and slightly warmer. Not tremendously, but just enough usually. And the flow over the western United States is mostly like this, where we have warm air moving up into Alaska. As a matter of fact, these are the years when Alaska is at its warmest, and they have very warm winter periods. If you go to the other extreme, where we have La Nina and what's called a negative phase, this is where the coastal or the tropical waters in the tropical Pacific are colder than normal, and in this negative phase of the PDO, the coastal waters are colder than normal with a large slug of warm water further out in the Pacific. These kind of conditions produce a ridging over this area and a troughing over the western United States. So we end up having the opposite kind of conditions that get kind of stuck in pattern. What happens during this type of time period? The Pacific Northwest is much colder and wetter, and California is drier and moderately colder. If you look at the broad patterns here, this La Nina negative phase right here is what we were stuck in half of 2009, 2010, 2011, and early 2012. We were absolutely stuck in it. We can go back in time and also see that we had periods of this condition. We can go back into 2006-07. We can go back into 98-99. And we can see prominent characteristics of that. Now there are, and I don't have this shown here in this diagram, but there are conditions that can happen where we have La Nada in the tropical Pacific and we have neutral conditions in the North Pacific. And that's kind of where we are right now. And so there's a little bit of information that can kind of come from that. So if we look at broad patterns, though, in terms of just basic understanding of what the characteristics are, this is what we tend to see between these two big sequences. El Nino, warm PDO, this is temperature, and La Nina, cold PDO, this is temperature. So you can see that during these type of conditions, the northern tier of climate divisions are pretty much warmer than normal, while everything to the south here is either normal or colder than normal. Here we go, La Nina, we just basically get a colder than normal western United States and a warmer than normal southeast. If you look at rainfall patterns, El Nino warm PDO produces typically a divide right at the Oregon-California border. We just don't want it to happen in our part of the Pacific Northwest, so we keep it right at the border. No, the basic idea is that in this kind of condition, everything to the north is pretty dry and everything to the south is relatively wet. I'm sorry, yeah, that's in precipitation. We're talking about dry and then wet. If you look at these La Nina cold PDOs, tremendous difference here between really Northern California and Pacific Northwest being extremely wet versus places in the south, from San Francisco south being much drier than normal. So kind of where does that leave us for the current situation? I took some data here just the other day. These are the current ocean temperatures as of May 20th, 2013. I know that doesn't necessarily mean a lot to you, but let me show you the comparison between two different time periods. This is May 20th, 2013, and this is January 2011. It doesn't really matter that it's January versus May. That's not the point. The point is that the ocean temperatures are very different. Look at the slug of cold water that existed back in this time period. This is what drove our cool vintages. We had that month in, month out for about 3.5 years. And what we're seeing right now is that this warm pool of water that existed out here has shifted across the ocean and is much more lined along the western United States. And the really cold waters that existed down here are starting to weaken across the tropics. And so those two things are really in combination kind of what's taken us to a relatively dry second half of the winter and then a relatively warm and dry start of the growing season so far. If we look at some of the, I forgot to say that I'm going to try to give you a forecast here. I pulled this down yesterday because I thought that this would be useful to say, I'm going to give you a useful with a pleasant degree of humor forecast. Do you guys use the Farmer's Almanac, anybody? So if you look at it this year, it's kind of really interesting. They got it right over about 2/3 of the country in terms of the late winter. They got it wrong out in the middle section of the country where it was really snowy and cold. But the map that was in the Farmer's Almanac for this spring it's really interesting to look at that. I can also use the Farmer's Almanac to talk about kind of what we have out here. I can roll the dice if you want. I can also use a magic ball. Which one would you like? Now, let me give you what I think I know is going on out there, a couple of different things. We are projected right now for the tropical Pacific to stay in neutral, what's called ENSO conditions, meaning la nada. We're supposed to stay in a la nada framework at least through late summer and potentially into early fall. We also know that the North Pacific, which has been in a negative phase, fairly cold coastal waters, is projected to continue to warm through late summer. So both of these conditions in combination typically produce this. They typically bring a slightly cooler than normal spring and near normal precipitation for the Pacific Northwest and a warm and dry California. Now, warm is good, dry may not be so good if it's prolonged, in terms of overall water availability. We also know that from these kind of conditions historically that we typically have a mixed summer in terms of conditions. It tends to vacillate around kind of normal, but it does tend to point, especially for points south, to more normal temperatures and then normal degree day accumulations across most of the West. So with that, I'm sure there's some areas we can have some conversations about some different aspects of this, but just some conclusions in general. First of all, the Lake County wine region, roughly about 200 growers, 8,500 acres planted, 1,500 feet or higher. I think Peter's going to give you a great fly through the region in a little bit, right? So you're going to get to see some of this landscape. We know it's in a mountain environment, and I like this statement that was made, that it's along the axis of cab in terms of production along the Mayacamas. We know that the landscape and climate conditions are suitable for a wide range of varieties that are being grown within the regions. Just some baseline information about Lake County, roughly about 2,800 to 3,800 degree days across most places where vineyards are planted. Median last spring frost is early to mid-April. Median first fall frost is early November to early December. 250 day long frost-free growing seasons, and annual rainfall of 33 to 45 inches. A couple of other things that I think are important that came out of our elevation of wine meetings that we had a while back was this idea that higher elevation areas, mountainous areas, do have a tendency to have some very prominent ultraviolet radiation influences on ripening. There's still a lot of research being done on that to try to better define what that really looks like, but we know high elevations do tend to have more UV. Higher elevations also have higher diurnal temperature ranges, which typically leads to greater retention and acidity during ripening. The other thing I think is important that occurs in a higher elevation environment too is this truncation of the season, where you really are kicked into cooler nights during ripening overall. There's some moderation of the effects around Clear Lake, and it produces both mountain valley breezes and some strong lake land breezes that enhance moderation depending on location within the area. And just to kind of put the summary of the forecast in place, tropical sea surface temperatures have warmed. They will not stay there. They'll stay there for the short term, but we need to pay attention to them as we move into the winter because that will determine our conditions for next spring. So what I tend to do is that I'm looking at this stuff. When I look at November, December, January in terms of tropical sea surface temperatures, they tell me a little bit about February, March, and April's conditions. So that's kind of how I keep track of it and keep looking at things. We do know that the North Pacific sea surface temperatures have warmed. They're still a little bit cooler than normal. Our models are not necessarily good enough to project that long term, because the Pacific acts like a very strong bathtub influence. It tends to slosh back and forth a little bit in terms of temperatures. So we need to keep an eye on that as well, but right now it indicates it's warmer than normal. Taken together, they tilt the odds, and that's kind of the best way that climatologists can say that's as good as it gets. It tilts the odds in favor of a cool and moderately dry in the south to slightly wet north late spring and early summer, and then everything is pointing to normal heat accumulations for the rest of the summer. All that being said, don't ask me if it's going to rain during harvest. Okay, we won't go there quite yet. So, thank you very much.